January 1st, 1953. A young taxi driver named Charles Carr pulled into a gas station in Oak Hill, West Virginia, and made a discovery that would shock the world. In the back seat of his Cadillac lay Hank Williams, country music's brightest star, cold and still at just 29 years old. The man who had given the world Your Cheatin' Heart and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry had sung his final song, but Hank's death was just the beginning of a story that would prove more dramatic than any ballad he ever wrote. Within hours, the vultures began circling, his estranged wife Audrey, his mother Lily, and a cast of characters that included managers, lawyers and gold diggers all began fighting over what was left of the man who couldn't even fight for himself anymore. The battle for Hank Williams' legacy would rage for decades, tearing apart families and revealing the ugly truth about what fame and fortune can do to people who were supposed to love him. This is the story of how America's greatest country songwriter lived fast, loved hard, and left behind a mess that would haunt his family for generations. It's a tale of betrayal, addiction, and the terrible price paid when talent and self-destruction collide. But most of all, it's the story of how Hank Williams broke his own heart so many times that when it finally stopped beating, nobody was surprised. They were just ready to profit from the pieces. Hiram Hank Williams was born September 17, 1923, in Mount Olive, Alabama, into a family that was already broken before he drew his first breath. His father, Lon Williams, was a World War I veteran whose mind had been shattered by shell shock and whose body would soon be confined to a veterans' hospital. His mother, Lily, was a force of nature wrapped in Sunday dress and steel-hard determination, ready to do whatever it took to survive. Lily Williams was the kind of woman who could charm a preacher on Sunday and cuss out a drunk on Monday. She ran boarding houses, sold moonshine, and wasn't above bending the law when circumstances required it. But she had one unwavering obsession. Her son Hank was going to be somebody special, no matter what it cost either of them. Hank was born with spina bifida occulta, a condition that would plague him with back pain for his entire short life. Even as a child, he walked differently, moved carefully, and seemed to carry a weight that other kids didn't understand. But he also had something else, a voice that could break hearts and a natural ability to turn pain into poetry. By age 8, Hank was learning guitar from a black street musician named Rufus Payne, who taught him not just chords and melodies, but the raw emotional honesty that would become his trademark. "You got to feel it, boy," Payne would tell him. "If you don't feel it, nobody else will either." It was a lesson Hank would carry with him forever, sometimes to his own destruction. Lily pushed her son relentlessly. She entered him in talent contests, got him radio appearances, and managed his early career with the ferocity of a prizefighter's manager. By his teens, Hank was performing regularly around Alabama, developing the stage presence and emotional connection with audiences that would make him a star. But success came with a price. The constant performing, the pressure from Lily, and the chronic pain from his back condition led Hank to discover alcohol and prescription drugs as teenagers. What started as occasional relief became regular use, then dependence, then the addiction that would define and ultimately end his life. In 1944, at just 20 years old, Hank met Audrey Shepard, a divorced mother who was as ambitious as she was beautiful. She saw in Hank not just a talented musician, but a ticket to the kind of life she'd always dreamed of. He saw in her a woman who believed in his talent and wasn't afraid to fight for his career. It seemed like a perfect match, but it was actually the beginning of a toxic relationship that would destroy them both. They married quickly, and Audrey immediately began positioning herself as Hank's manager and creative partner. She had opinions about his songs, his performances, and his career decisions, most of which centered around making him more commercially successful and making her more important in the process. The marriage was passionate and volatile from the start. They fought constantly about everything: money, music, other women, and Audrey's attempts to control every aspect of Hank's life. But they also had a genuine love for each other, at least in the beginning, and their fights were often followed by passionate reconciliations that only made the next explosion more destructive. By the late 1940s, Hank Williams was becoming a major force in country music. His songs were raw, honest, and emotionally devastating in a way that set them apart from the more polished Nashville sound. Lovesick Blues, Mind Your Own Business, and Wedding Bells established him as more than just another country singer. He was a poet of heartbreak, a voice for everyone who'd ever loved someone who didn't love them back. His success on the Grand Ole Opry made him a national star, but it also increased the pressure on his already fragile personal life. The demands of constant touring, recording and performing were brutal, and Hank's response was to drink more and take more pills to manage both the physical pain from his back and the emotional pain from his increasingly troubled marriage. Audrey's ambitions grew along with Hank's fame. She wanted to be a performer herself, despite having limited vocal ability, and she used her position as Hank's wife to force her way into recording sessions and performances. The tension this created was obvious to everyone around them, but Hank was too dependent on pills and alcohol to effectively resist her demands. Meanwhile, Hank's womanizing became legendary within country music circles. He had affairs with backup singers, fans, and anyone else who caught his eye during his travels. Some were one-night stands fueled by loneliness and alcohol. Others were more serious relationships that threatened his marriage and his career. But all of them were symptoms of a man who was desperately trying to fill an emptiness that no amount of success or love could satisfy. Audrey knew about most of the affairs, and they became another source of violent fights between them. She would confront him with evidence, he would deny everything, then confess, then promise to change. The cycle repeated endlessly, each iteration doing more damage to both their relationship and their individual sanity. The birth of their son, Randall Hank Williams, later known as Hank Jr., in 1949, briefly stabilized the marriage, but it also added new pressure. Hank loved his son desperately, but his addiction and touring schedule made him an inconsistent father at best. Audrey used their child as a weapon in their fights, threatening to leave and take Hank Jr. with her whenever she wanted to hurt Hank most deeply. By 1951, Hank's personal life was spiraling out of control, but his career was reaching new heights. Songs like Cold, Cold Heart and Hey Good Looking were crossing over to pop charts, making him one of the first country artists to achieve true mainstream success. But the success only made his personal problems worse, giving him more money to spend on pills and alcohol, more opportunities for infidelity, and more pressure from Audrey to make her a star too. The beginning of the end came in 1952, when Hank's behavior became too erratic for even the forgiving country music industry to ignore. He was missing shows, appearing drunk on stage, and alienating the people who had supported his career. The Grand Ole Opry, which had made him a star, finally fired him after he failed to show up for a New Year's Eve performance. The firing devastated Hank more than anyone realized. The Opry wasn't just his workplace, it was his artistic home, the place where he'd proven himself worthy of respect. Being kicked out felt like a rejection of everything he'd worked for, and his response was to dive even deeper into the bottles and pill containers that were slowly killing him. Audrey had finally reached her breaking point too. The constant fighting, the public humiliation of Hank's affairs, and his increasingly dangerous behavior convinced her that staying married to him was more costly than leaving him. In 1952, she filed for divorce, taking Hank Jr. with her and demanding a substantial settlement. The divorce proceedings were bitter and public, with both sides airing every piece of dirty laundry they could find. Audrey accused Hank of adultery, drug abuse, and physical violence. Hank accused Audrey of being a gold digger who had never loved him for anything but his money and fame. The press covered every detail with the enthusiasm of sports reporters covering a championship fight. But the worst part for Hank wasn't the public humiliation or the financial settlement. It was losing daily contact with his son. Hank Jr. was the one pure thing in his life, the person he loved without complication or agenda. The thought of his boy growing up without him drove Hank to even more desperate behavior. In the middle of the divorce proceedings, Hank impulsively married Billie Jean Jones, a 19-year-old beauty queen, in October 1952. The marriage was partly genuine affection, partly spite toward Audrey, and partly a desperate attempt to prove he could still attract a beautiful woman. But it was doomed from the start. Billie Jean had married a country music star, but what she got was a broken-down addict who was more interested in pills than romance. The last months of Hank's life were a blur of missed appointments, cancelled shows, and increasingly desperate attempts to stay relevant in an industry that was losing patience with his unreliability. His new manager, Oscar Davis, tried to book him for smaller venues where his erratic behavior would be less damaging, but even those gigs often ended in disaster. Hank's pill consumption had reached dangerous levels. He was taking morphine, barbiturates, and amphetamines in combinations that would have killed most people. His tolerance was so high that he needed massive doses just to function, but those same doses made it impossible for him to perform coherently. He was trapped in a pharmaceutical prison of his own making. His relationship with Billie Jean deteriorated rapidly as she realized she'd married a ghost. The charming, talented man she'd fallen in love with was disappearing behind a haze of drugs and alcohol. Their fights were as explosive as his battles with Audrey had been, but without the shared history to provide any foundation for reconciliation. On December 30th, 1952, Hank was scheduled to perform concerts in Charleston, West Virginia, and Canton, Ohio. The weather was terrible, making flying dangerous, so he hired Charles Carr, a young chauffeur, to drive him. It was a decision that would lead directly to his death, though not in the way anyone expected. Hank was in terrible condition when they left Montgomery. He was heavily sedated, barely coherent, and showing signs of the heart problems that his drug abuse had caused. A responsible manager would have cancelled the shows and gotten him medical attention. Instead, they loaded him into the back seat of a Cadillac and hoped he'd improve during the drive. The trip was a nightmare from the start. Hank was unconscious most of the time, rousing only occasionally to ask for more pills or alcohol. Carr, who was just 18 years old and had no experience dealing with addicted celebrities, did his best to keep Hank comfortable while navigating treacherous winter roads. When Charles Carr stopped for gas in Oak Hill, West Virginia, on New Year's Day morning, he made the discovery that country music fans had been dreading for years. Hank Williams, the man who'd given voice to a generation's heartbreak, was dead in the back seat of his car. He was 29 years old. The immediate cause of death was heart failure, but the real cause was the accumulated damage from years of drug and alcohol abuse. Hank's heart, weakened by constant chemical assault, had simply given up during the night. The coroner found lethal levels of morphine and alcohol in his system, along with barbiturates that would have been dangerous by themselves. The news of Hank's death spread quickly through the tight-knit country music community and then out to his millions of fans. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to play his songs. The Grand Ole Opry, which had fired him just a year earlier, dedicated their next show to his memory. Fans gathered outside record stores and radio stations, sharing memories and mourning the loss of a voice that had spoken directly to their hearts. But even before Hank's body was cold, the vultures began circling. His death had turned him from a troubled performer into a valuable commodity, and everyone who had any connection to him wanted their piece of the pie. Audrey immediately positioned herself as Hank's widow, despite their divorce being final. She claimed that as the mother of his child and his former wife, she was entitled to control his estate and legacy. She hired lawyers and began making public statements about Hank's wishes and her role in his career. Billie Jean, his actual widow, countered with her own claims. As his legal wife at the time of his death, she argued that she was entitled to his estate and the right to make decisions about his legacy. She had marriage certificates and witnesses to prove her relationship with Hank was legitimate. Lily Williams, Hank's mother, entered the fight with her own agenda. She had sacrificed everything for her son's career, she claimed, and deserved to be compensated for her investment. Moreover, she argued that she understood Hank's artistic vision better than either of his wives and should have control over how his music was presented to the public. The legal battles that followed were vicious and prolonged. Each party hired teams of lawyers and fought over every aspect of Hank's legacy, his songs, his recordings, his name, his image, and even his personal belongings. The fights were conducted in courtrooms and in the press, with each side trying to present themselves as Hank's true representative, while portraying the others as opportunistic gold diggers. The immediate aftermath of Hank's death revealed just how complicated his affairs had become. His estate included valuable song copyrights, ongoing recording contracts, and potential earnings from his growing legend. But it also included substantial debts, unpaid taxes, and legal obligations that complicated any attempt to settle his affairs cleanly. Audrey's strategy was to emphasize her role in Hank's career development and her status as the mother of his child. She gave interviews claiming that she had been the driving force behind his success, that his best songs had been inspired by their relationship, and that she was the only person qualified to protect his artistic legacy. She also used Hank Jr. as leverage, arguing that any settlement should prioritize his inheritance and future. Billie Jean's approach was more straightforward, but equally determined. She was the legal widow, she pointed out, and Alabama law was clear about a wife's rights to her husband's estate. She accused Audrey of trying to profit from a relationship that had ended in divorce and painted herself as the victim of a gold-digging scheme by Hank's former wife. Lily Williams played her cards more subtly, but just as aggressively. As the person who had discovered and developed Hank's talent, she claimed moral authority over his legacy. She also held significant practical power, since many of Hank's business relationships had been conducted through her, and she had access to information and contacts that the others lacked. The legal battles dragged on for years, with each victory by one party leading to appeals and countersuits by the others. Meanwhile, Hank's music continued to generate income, but much of it was tied up in legal proceedings while lawyers grew rich from the fighting. The public spectacle was deeply damaging to Hank's reputation and to the country music industry as a whole. Fans who had mourned his death as a tragic loss of talent were disgusted by the petty fighting over his money. The press covered every development with the enthusiasm they usually reserved for Hollywood scandals, turning Hank's legacy into tabloid fodder. Perhaps no one was hurt more by the ongoing battles than Hank Williams Jr., who was just 3 years old when his father died. He grew up in the middle of a war zone, with his mother, grandmother and stepmother all fighting over his father's legacy and, by extension, his own future. Audrey raised Hank Jr. with the constant message that he was destined to carry on his father's musical tradition. She pushed him into performing at an early age, billing him as a continuation of the Hank Williams story, rather than allowing him to develop his own identity. The pressure was enormous for a child who barely remembered his father, but was expected to embody his spirit. As Hank Jr. grew older, he began to understand the extent to which his father's legacy had been commodified and fought over. He saw how his mother, grandmother and stepmother had all used his father's name and reputation to advance their own interests. He watched as lawyers and managers grew rich from his father's songs, while the family continued to fight over the scraps. The realization that his father had been more valuable dead than alive, and that his own future was being determined by people who saw him primarily as a source of income, profoundly affected Hank Jr.'s development. He struggled with his own identity, unsure whether he was a person in his own right or just a vessel for continuing his father's career. When he came of age and began to have legal standing in the disputes over his father's estate, Hank Jr. found himself facing the same choice that had confronted Audrey, Billie Jean and Lily: fight for his piece of the pie or walk away from the whole mess. He chose to fight, partly out of financial necessity and partly out of a desire to have some control over how his father was remembered. The legal battles over Hank Williams's estate continued into the 1960s and beyond, becoming a template for the kind of posthumous celebrity exploitation that would later plague the estates of Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, and other major figures. Each time one dispute was settled, new issues arose: unauthorized biographies, movie rights, merchandise deals, and tribute albums all became sources of conflict. Audrey remained the most visible combatant in these fights, giving interviews and writing articles that portrayed her as the keeper of Hank's true legacy. She released her own recordings, trying to capitalize on her connection to Hank, and appointed herself as the authority on what he would have wanted. Her efforts were largely unsuccessful artistically, but they kept her in the public eye and reinforced her claims to be his most important heir. Billie Jean, who had remarried and tried to build a quiet life away from the spotlight, was drawn back into the battles whenever significant money was at stake. She maintained her legal claims while trying to avoid the public attention that Audrey seemed to crave. Lily Williams, who lived until 1955, spent her final years fighting to maintain control over her son's legacy while watching it be torn apart by the people who claimed to love him. Her death removed one major player from the game, but didn't end the conflicts, since her share of the disputes was inherited by other family members who continued the battles. The fighting wasn't just about money, though money was certainly a major factor. It was also about the right to define who Hank Williams had been and what he had represented. Each party had their own version of his story, their own interpretation of his life and death, and their own vision of how he should be remembered. As the decades passed and the legal battles continued, it became clear that the fighting over Hank Williams' legacy had accomplished something he never could have achieved in life. It had made his personal relationships more famous than his music. People who had never heard Your Cheatin' Heart knew about the battles between Audrey and Billie Jean. The dysfunctional aftermath of his death had become as much a part of his legend as the songs themselves. The irony was devastating. Hank had spent his short life trying to turn his pain into art, to find meaning in his suffering by transforming it into music that could touch other people's hearts. But after his death, his pain had been transformed into entertainment of a much baser sort: legal drama and family feuds that titillated the public, but had nothing to do with his artistic achievement. His music, meanwhile, continued to influence generations of performers who found in his songs the same raw honesty that had made them revolutionary. Bob Dylan called him the master. Johnny Cash credited him as a primary influence. Country, rock and folk musicians all drew inspiration from his ability to distill complex emotions into simple, powerful lyrics. But for the people who had known him personally, his legacy was complicated by the knowledge of how much he had suffered and how little peace he had found, either in life or death. The man who had written "I'm so lonesome I could cry" had indeed been lonesome, and his death had only made that loneliness more profound by turning it into a commodity to be bought and sold. By the 1980s, most of the original participants in the battles over Hank Williams' legacy were dead. Audrey died in 1975, still fighting legal battles and still claiming to be the definitive authority on her former husband's life and career. Billie Jean passed away in 1988, having spent decades trying to balance her claims to Hank's legacy with her desire for a normal life away from the spotlight. Hank Jr., who had struggled for decades to establish his own musical identity while living in his father's shadow, finally broke free in the 1980s with a more rock-influenced sound that was distinctly his own. But even his success couldn't completely escape the pull of his father's legend, and he continued to perform his father's songs and tell his father's story in concerts and interviews. The legal disputes never completely ended, but they eventually became less significant as the major players died and the potential earnings from new conflicts became smaller than the costs of pursuing them. Hank Williams' music became part of the American songbook, his influence acknowledged by musicians across all genres, and his story absorbed into the mythology of country music. But the damage done by the decades of fighting was permanent. A man who had died young, leaving behind some of the most beautiful and honest songs ever written about love and loss, was remembered as much for the greed and betrayal that followed his death as for the art that had preceded it. His personal relationships, which had been painful enough during his lifetime, became public spectacles that reduced complex human emotions to tabloid headlines. The Hank Williams story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame, addiction, and the way that death can turn a person into a commodity. But it was a lesson that the music industry seemed reluctant to learn fully. Similar patterns would emerge with other performers who struggled with addiction and died young, leaving behind valuable estates and competing claims from family members and business associates. The exploitation of deceased celebrities became a standard business practice, with lawyers and managers developing sophisticated strategies for maximizing posthumous earnings while minimizing the rights of actual heirs. The template established by the battles over Hank's legacy would be refined and applied to the estates of Elvis Presley, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, and countless other artists who died before they could fully control their own legacies. Perhaps more troublingly, the focus on posthumous profits often overshadowed efforts to address the underlying problems that had led to these early deaths. The music industry's response to addiction and mental health issues among performers remained largely reactive, focused on managing crises rather than preventing them. Today, more than 70 years after his death, Hank Williams remains one of the most influential figures in American popular music. His songs continue to be recorded by new artists, his influence can be heard across multiple genres, and his life story continues to fascinate biographers, documentary filmmakers, and music historians. But the battles over his legacy serve as a reminder of the human cost of fame and the way that death can transform art into commerce. The man who wrote "I'm so lonesome I could cry" was indeed lonely, and his loneliness was exploited by people who claimed to love him long after he was gone. The true tragedy of Hank Williams wasn't just that he died young, though that was certainly tragic enough. It was that his death became the beginning of a new kind of performance, one in which his memory was manipulated and his legacy was fought over by people who turned his pain into their profit. His music survives because it was genuine, because it came from a place of authentic emotion that couldn't be manufactured or imitated. But his personal story survives too, as a warning about what happens when talent, addiction, and greed collide in the spotlight of fame. In the end, Hank Williams gave the world his heart in his songs, and then watched as the people closest to him fought over the pieces when that heart finally stopped beating. The king of country music had sung his last song, but the vultures were just getting started. And in their feeding frenzy over his corpse, they created a legacy of betrayal and exploitation that would echo through the music industry for decades to come. Hank Williams had broken his own heart so many times while he was alive that when it finally stopped, nobody was surprised. They were just ready to profit from what was left behind.